Okay. So it's like a previous president. It's always called President, President Obama or President Biden or, yeah, I mean, you always have kind of that office amongst you and you still have the privileges. So Annas was the father-in-law of the current high priest, who's Caiaphas, and we'll get to him. That's what we're today. But when he was before Annas, this story was only told in the book of John, and we see that when we talk about the denials of Peter, because which we're going to do again today if we get that far. Because see, writing the Bible is all a matter of perspective, where you are and what it is you see or hear or know. So in John's case, he tells the story with Peter that they followed from a distance behind Jesus as he was being arrested and taken to the house of Annas. But John, who was known to the high priest, got to go in, and Peter waited outside. Okay. And the story that we'll see today in Matthew is that the same thing. Peter followed from a distance, but it says he sat outside for a while, and then it says he went in. But see, the difference is John is the one telling the story about he was the one known by the high priest. Where Matthew is looking at it, he doesn't know where John went, and all these guys were scattered. He just knows that Peter, was involved. Anyway, so Jesus appeared before Annas, and it was, it may have been that Caiaphas had Annas kind of soften up Jesus for him, because in that same story, then he appears before Annas. Okay, and that's where we were in John when we stopped all of this. So in chapter 26 in Matthew, that's where we are. It's going to be, let me get my right papers out here versus my wrong papers. Okay. So it starts in Matthew 26, 57 through 78, if you want to turn there in your Bible. And in the first, let's see. Does anybody want to read real loud into the microphone? And somebody say something into the microphone. I want to see if they're coming out the speakers here. They should be. Oh, wait. No, wait, they're not, because I don't have the switch turned on. And everything's black and I can't see.
Howard, can you hear?
No, wait a minute.
Howard, can you hear us?
Well, Howard should be able to.
That's a big no. It must be a no. Either that or he's unconscious. I think he froze.
He can hear me. Yeah, he's probably. Howard, can you hear?
I can hear fine.
Can you hear Dennis?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. Do you guys hear out the speakers? Dennis, say something again.
Yes, can you hear it now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's coming out.
Okay. Okay. Close enough. Close enough. I need to be able to call up to the sound booth and say, hey, we need more volume or whatever, but we don't. Anyway, did anybody want to read loudly into the microphone? Matthew 25 or 26, 57 through 68.
68.
68. Anybody want to read that? Okay, right, read real so that they can hear in the microphone.
So before the Sanhedrin, those who had arrested Jesus took into Caiaphas, the high priest, where the preachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right?
No. Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay.
By the high priest, he entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus, so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? what is the testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied, for I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Almighty One, and coming on clouds of heaven. And said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do you need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with his fist. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you?
Oh, okay, good. You know, the handout, I should have explained this, the handout is where we're going for however long it takes us to finish this, this section, okay? This isn't all for, all for today. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go through these trials, then we're gonna go through the actual crucifixion, Jesus on the cross, and then we're going to do the death, the burial, being put in the tomb, and then we're going to stop. We're going to leave Jesus in the tomb. Okay? And then what we're going to do is for the summer, I'm going to do like a 10-week course class on the book of Esther. There's 9 chapters, so we'd have to go pretty fast. But an introductory of what's happening, where they are, where it's located, what's the time period, and stuff like that. When we come back, after that, then we're going to go to the resurrection, okay? But what I want to do is I want to do the resurrection story as we have it in the, as we have it in the scriptures. I want us to see where we see Jesus further down, and that would be the descriptions of Jesus in, say, the book of Revelation. So that, and then also to go through all the attributes that Jesus has, the attributes that God has, the attributes that God the Father has, and the attributes that Jesus has that makes him God, that we identify him as God. So that's where we're going with, with that. Anyway, so it says here on this in Matthew 27, in verse 57 says, and then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. This is the same as when they took him to Annas. They're in the same building. It's just dad and his son. Annas was high priest maybe 5 years or something like that. And then Caiaphas was high priest for like, I don't know, 15 years, 18 years, something like that. I think he had 2 more brothers that were high priests. It was kind of the family business. And that's what the high priesthood had become from compared to what it was meant to be when God gave it all to Moses, who passed it down to Aaron and his sons. It became really pretty much, a family business. So anyway, so these guys bring him to Caiaphas. So you wonder, if they were working off of a bounty or something. They seem pretty anxious to arrest Jesus and get him to the high priest. And they went right to the high priest, and the high priest is waiting there with the scribes and the elders, waiting for him. Caiaphas was the big deal in town. Okay. He was the big dog. He was, boss hog, of the Jewish nation, like that. He wasn't a nice guy. He wasn't a terrible bad guy, but he wasn't a nice guy, and stuff like that. And he really ruled. Not quite a mafia boss. But think about this: these priests, these high priests, and the scribes and the elders, we'll see that they make up the Sanhedrin, which is called the Sanhedrin. And really, that's kind of like the legal body there in Jerusalem. Okay, but you figure, how bad do they have to think Jesus is? Remember, Jesus is just one person. How bad would a person have to be to get to be brought up before the president and his cabinet, say? I mean, he'd have to be some kind of real threat, or at least some kind of perceived threat. And that's, pardon?
Perceived.
Yeah, perceived, threat. Especially since Jesus was no political threat, he was no physical threat. He probably was a threat to the religious system. But that's what's happening. It's just like if there was somebody that the government was so afraid of that they brought him directly to the president and say the cabinet. So that's where they were. So they come in, and then Matthew brings up the part about Peter, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now, this is important. What's Peter's expectation that's going to happen? Pardon?
Deny Christ.
Well, no, but when he's going there, what's his expectation of what he's going to see?
They're gonna turn him loose.
Huh?
They're gonna turn him
No, he
loose.
said he sat with the guards to see the end. And he goes, it's going to be the end. Our Lord's going to be terminated. I might as well be there to see the end. It's not like he's hopeful. He's not like he's expecting Jesus to stand up and have rays come out of his eyes and, like that. He's there to see the end. Were you gonna say something? Right.
Well, I think it wasn't Caiaphas the one that said that the sheriffs would put one man to death and the whole nation suffered.
I don't remember if it was Caiaphas. It was one of them. Yeah, like that. Yeah. Well, it was in the same, pardon? No, I don't remember which one it was, but yeah, that's the thing, is that when they were talking about arresting Jesus in the Sanhedrin, someone stood up and said, we got to do something because they were afraid of Rome. They weren't afraid of Jesus. Like, they were afraid of Rome. But he says, better that one man die than all of us get killed, which was really prophetic. They didn't know that. They weren't even thinking of it in those terms. Like that, but this is serious.
But they didn't have the power of death over him. They couldn't kill him. They had to bring him before Pilate.
Right. Yeah. No, they didn't have the power of death. And that's the thing, is that in the whole Roman Empire, the localities never had that ultimate power, so. Anyway, so that's Peter. Now it says, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. Doesn't that seem strange? That they're seeking false testimony?
The other stuff won't work. That's their interest.
Well, it's really funny. You would think that they would be seeking truthful testimony, someone to come up and say, yeah, this guy's a blasphemer, this guy threatened Rome, this guy did, but it says that they were seeking false testimony.
Well, the thing was, 2,000 years later, we're doing the same thing. You bring me to prison, we'll find something to charge you.
Yeah, there you go.
And you're doing the same thing with Jesus.
Yeah, no. So they're seeking false testimony, and it's probably because they want to get some. Why don't they just bring the charges?
Don't stick their neck out.
Huh?
They don't want to stick their neck out.
Yeah, they're the court. Court can't bring charges. Our courts can't bring charges. You have to go through the court. So they know that. They know they don't have the authority to bring the charges. So they have to see. So gotta remember, so they're doing this all on their own. And now that, it's kind of like what Ray said, okay, now we got them, and now we got the case built up, but we need somebody else to make the case because we can't make the case. So it says in verse 60, it says, they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. Makes you wonder, because we don't think in a matter of time. We just read through. How long did they sit there as an organized, called body? We're called here. We're going to sit here until we get this resolved. I mean, was it days? I mean, it doesn't say it, but it could have been. You see, we lose track of the time because we compress it all into the, into the story. So first of all, they have to convene. They have to have Jesus there. They have to say, okay, these these are the charges. Now we need the testimony. I mean, who's going to be there? So they got to, I would imagine, send out, kind of like you see with these class action lawsuits. If you've taken this drug, you may be due compensation. Then what the class action attorneys do is they just sit back for a year waiting for people to call in on their commercials. They're seeking people that can testify, this happened to me when I took this drug, or whatever the class action may be. So they may have been sitting here for days waiting to have people come in. And then it says that many false witnesses came forward. How long did it take for each false witness to, and that's funny because they're seeking false testimony. They have false witnesses, but they still turn them down. I don't know if it's because they know the story is just too far made up. Well, they are actually looking for something, because you see what it says right after this. It says, at last, 2 came forward. Remember, these are false witnesses. Like that. And said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. They told the truth. I mean, they actually brought true testimony. Okay. And it always shows the enemies of Jesus listen and get it. They understand what Jesus, disciples are with Jesus all the time and they never get it. I mean, they missed the whole thing. But there's several times, well, I shouldn't say several, there's a couple of times where we have just this kind of testimony where the enemies of Christ repeat back what they heard Jesus say. We see that in, because we'll see by Caiaphas's reaction, but I think it's in John chapter 5. I think it's in verse 18. I think I'm getting a message. No, but where they said that Jesus said that God was his father, he said, and you'll see the works. And they said, whoa, this is blasphemy. This man has made God to be his father and himself to be equal with God. They heard it, they understood it. I mean, they thought it was blasphemy, but they understood exactly what he was saying. And so many today will say, Jesus never claimed to be God. But that's all the times that they were trying to kill him, was for blasphemy. And blasphemy is only claiming to be God. To claim to be the Messiah isn't blasphemy. They had a whole bunch of people running around saying that they were the Messiah. They never strung any of them up. But Jesus was claiming to be, claiming to be.
We have that today, don't we?
What's that?
People are running around claiming they are the Messiah.
You overheard me? Well, we do. I mean, everybody always wants a piece of Jesus. They can deny who Jesus is, but everybody wants a piece of Jesus. Everybody wants to include Jesus, a Jesus, in their story, in their religion, just not the Jesus of the Bible, but there's just something about, you associate yourself with Jesus. Doesn't care. I mean, you could be a total anti-Jesus person, but as long as I was probably watching a clip because I don't think I've ever watched the show, but The View, everybody know The View? Oh, come on, everybody knows what The View is. Used to be I wouldn't claim, you won't go to hell if you watched it. I mean, you might smell the smoke, but no, but on The View, so Joy Behar, or something like that. Anyway, and she Jewish, I'm sure she's never been to synagogue, but anyway, but she's Jewish, and they were talking to the guy who plays Jesus in The Chosen, and she's talking about something about the show, or he's talking something about the show, and it was really on the nice side of Jesus, not the judgmental side of Jesus. And she says, she goes, of course. She goes, see, that's the Jesus we all love. Pardon?
I was surprised.
Oh, so you heard it. So it's not just my imagination. Yeah, but that's the way people, yes, that's the Jesus we all love. You know, the one who has no standards or judgment or, law or anything. Pardon?
True.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so these guys, they heard him say, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And what did John say? In the Gospel of John, in chapter 2, when Jesus was standing outside the temple and they're marveling at how wonderful it is. And he says, it took 46 years to build this, but I'll destroy it, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Then John says, and this is an afterthought, I'm sure, when John's writing the gospel years later, he said, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Like that. So they heard him correctly, these people. So they bring this chart. Now, if somebody said that today, okay, I can tear down this church and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Are we calling the cops? I mean, we might call bomb squad, but no, I mean, are we calling the cops on them? But that's what they're doing here, because it says the high priest stood up. This is verse 62. The high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? So I have a feeling this is the first time that Caiaphas is hearing this story, and so he's just saying, he goes, hey, I think we got something here. What do you have to say? Yeah. So let's see. But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, he's asking him about being the Christ, asking him about being the Son of God. He didn't ask him if he's God, but the fact that he's asking him about being the Son of God, that had meaning back then. That meant you were God. Yeah, okay. So he's saying, he goes, now when he says, I adjure you, that's putting him under oath. So Jesus, when he wanted to stay silent, stood silent, but when he was put under oath, Jesus follows the law. Okay. So Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. So Jesus said to him, you have said so. It's like saying, you said it, buddy. At least that's my interpretation of those words. He says, you have said it. Now you'd think that Jesus, he goes, maybe I don't want to cause trouble. He goes, okay, you said it. Yeah, you got me. That's what I said. But he goes on further. And he says, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. That's kind of like a challenge to him. He's saying that, the Son of Man is going to be seated at the right hand of power. That's up there with God, and coming with the clouds of heaven. And I think we talked about this in Master's Men, about the clouds of heaven in Daniel's chapter 7, when Daniel's seeing the vision of heaven with the Ancient of Days, who's God the Father, and he sees Jesus appearing, coming with the clouds of heaven. And the Father gives Jesus all authority. So the high priest, they know this from the Daniel story. So when Jesus is saying, you'll see the Son of Man, which is called the Son of Man in Daniel, sees the Son of Man coming in the clouds, Caiaphas knows exactly what he's talking about. People today will say, well, no, they do. Because I'm talking to a lot of people that are like this, that are Unitarians, who say, no, but he never claimed to be God. He never said, let me give you my card. Jesus Christ, God, would have made things a lot easier, but it wouldn't have, because they knew exactly what it meant. But it doesn't maybe mean that to us in a general population today, but back then it actually, meant something. Right,
It doesn't make sense though.
nothing makes sense.
That they are bringing him before the court. And they've been expecting a Messiah this whole time, the whole jurisdiction waiting for the Messiah. They get him to confess that he is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And then they say, well, we've got to put him to death.
The,
You're the one we're waiting for, but we don't believe you're the one we're waiting for.
and it makes you wonder, were they actually waiting for Messiah? You'd be hard pressed today to find a Jew who's actually waiting for a physical Messiah. They gave that up a long time ago. Then it was after that for probably the last century, it was, well, a messianic age is going to come upon us, and now it's nothing. Okay. So I have a feeling, I have a feeling that the tradition may have been waiting for this Messiah to come. The general population may have been expecting a Messiah to come, but those in power don't want their boat rocked.
Well, the apostles believed it
What's
because
that?
the apostles believed it, that he was the Messiah, because he goes and introduces, one of the apostles introduces the other one, says, the Messiah, the one we've been reading about, is here.
Right, but even their expectation was wrong, because they were expecting a soldier type of Messiah to come and conquer Rome, to release them from their servitude to Rome. So they even had that wrong. We saw that on Fridays in the book of Acts, in that introductory chapter, where the first thing they're asking when Jesus is getting ready to be ascended, they say, is it at this time that you're going to restore Israel? So even up to that point, they've got this thing of, a conquering Messiah. And what did it say? Jesus said, this isn't for you to know, but here's what I have for you, is to become witnesses for me and go into, Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and into the entire world. Forget about all that conquering, so everybody, and again, that even today, everybody has this different view of who Messiah is. So it's easy to say Jesus, and everybody conjures up their own Jesus like that. And we probably, if we had somebody draw a picture of the Jesus that you're picturing in your mind, not so much the physical description, but what you think his purpose is, and we'd probably come up with 10 different purposes, just because of all the years. We think that we're studying just the Bible, and so that we know now we've got input coming from all over, past teachers, books we've read, in Christian bookstores, half the books are junk, radios, listening to radio programs and stuff, like listening to me, and we just spit out all this, I don't want to say contradictory information, but it varies some. Okay, Andy.
I think many people believe today that Jesus will be here as an arbitrator, not the end of your, as the beginning of the doer, an arbitrator between.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it could be a whole bunch of things, and like I said, or if I said, hey, write down a paragraph for me of what you think Jesus's purpose, or the purpose that he was to come for, and what is he doing today, and then probably be different. And it doesn't mean that some are right. Well, some are right and some are wrong, but it doesn't mean that they're all right or they're all wrong. It's just the way that we've filtered the information. But then if I said, well, here's the truth. Jesus came for these 3 reasons, and this is what Jesus is doing today. And you would all say, yeah, that's what I think too, because it is. But we just don't filter it that way. Anyway, so got to ask that. Does anybody have a last thing before I move on? Before I get off my nonsense? Let's see. So he says, you're going to see him with power coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy." Again, they understood what he was saying. Caiaphas understood what he was saying. And according to their law, it probably was blasphemy, because nobody can claim to be God except God. So anybody who's not God and claiming to be God, they're a blasphemer. But if in Jesus' case, if he is God, he isn't blaspheming. Oh my God. So again, the enemies. Now here's the thing. So remember I said they can't bring the charges? What's Caiaphas do here? He gets up, tears his robe, and says, "We don't need to hear anymore." He said, what's he say the words? He says, "What further witness do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy." So Caiaphas is the one who's actually bringing the charge of blasphemy, because the other witnesses didn't. So he's breaking his own rule. Maybe next time I'll bring in, there's a whole list of laws that are broken on this night, where they go through the 7 trials. And in every step of the way, the Jews are breaking their own laws to do it. They just don't do it right. So then he says, what is your judgment? And they answered, "He deserves death." So they're getting what they want. They just wanted to be able to write down on a legal document, "He's a blasphemer, and by our law, he deserves death." And then they have to handle it, because they can't carry out the death penalty. So judgment's in, the verdict's in, it's death. And then, like we do in all courts, then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" And this is just pure mockery. Like that. You would think at that point when they're doing that they would say, "Well, this guy's a crazy guy. That's why we're mocking him and we're spitting on him and stuff like that. He's a crazy guy. Maybe we need to send him to a mental institution instead of wanting to put him to death." But they say, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you?" And again, it's that thing is they're just doing it because he's claiming to be, he's claiming to be Messiah. He's claiming to be God. They don't believe that it's true. And that's why they're putting him to the challenge. Well, prophesy. If you can, what did they say when he was on the cross? If you're the Christ, why doesn't he come down off the cross? And Jesus could have come down off the cross. And I'll bet you Jesus could have answered these people, but that's not his purpose. His purpose isn't to prove them wrong. Jesus could have said, he could have said this several times in the Gospels. He could have said, "No, you misunderstand. Let me tell you, let's sit down. Got some coffee? Let me explain it. Let me explain it to you from my perspective." He doesn't do that. He just takes it. When in John chapter 6, when after they fed the 5,000, and then all those disciples are following him, and he gives his bread of life talk, and he's talking about how he was the manna, he's the bread of life, come down from heaven. Unless you eat my blood or my body, my body, and all the disciples left. Now he could have said, "Wait, whoa, you guys misunderstood me. Wait. I'm not saying this literally." Like that. But he said, "Don't let the door hit you in the butt on your way out." And that's what he turned to the disciples and said, "Are you guys going to go too?" And they go, "Where else we're gonna go?" But see, Jesus is there to bring that sword to divide the people. Those who don't believe and those who believe. So that moment could have been like the separating of the sheep and the goats. that we would have seen in chapter 25 in Matthew. You know, it could be the wheat and the wheat and the tares, you know, the dividing of those. And this is just another part of that Jesus wants people to know their guilt. You know, I don't think there's anywhere that says what their reaction was after Jesus was crucified. I know that I'm talking about the high priest and all that. I know that after he rose from the dead, they made up stories, you know, say they stole the body, say this, you know, like that. But it's not like, you just wonder, sitting in their dead, going, It does seem strange, even though I think something was up, it does seem strange that he is gone, or he appears to be gone, or, you know, however you would word it. That's like that. We don't see.
Well, they were pretty much of a mindset that irregardless, if Jesus had spoken up in self-defense and given them all the information that they wanted, you're not going to convince me because this is the way it is. This is the way we want to see it. I mean, we break the law, we sin. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
And that's the way they view it.
Now he convinced two people. He convinced Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, because they were part of the Sanhedrin that would have been sitting and listening to this. So he at least got two individuals. But remember, Nicodemus came to him by night. Joseph of Arimathea seemed to have come forth a little more publicly. Yeah, you know, like that. But it wasn't like, but I don't think anybody in this group said, you know, maybe we should listen to this guy a little bit more and not be hasty. But they had a time limit. I mean, they had to get him, you know, they had to get him on the cross and off the cross before the Sabbath. So they were under pressure a little. Joe.
Yeah, that was the whole point with Nicodemus, though. Nicodemus didn't come and say, I know you're from God. He came and said, we.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many more were there? There was a bunch who were keeping their mouths shut because they didn't want to be stripped of their power or position.
Yeah.
But there was multiple, evidently.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah, I mean, it would be great to be a fly on the wall. You know, so when they take Jesus out, because they're going to take him out and they're going to send him over to Pontius Pilate. Okay. And I think that we saw in the John account that they took him over to the Praetorium where Pontius Pilate was, but they wouldn't go in because they didn't want to defile themselves and be unclean by going into a Gentile court right before the Passover, when you have strict laws of how many days you have to be clean before you can, you know, participate.
That's the same point we get into not only with our own spiritual position, but with our secular law. You know, if we in this whole room all decided, you know, Dennis is deserving of dying, we're gathered here to condemn Dennis.
Let's roast him on the new barbecue.
Who among you would stand up and say, oh no, Dennis is a good guy because you might die with him?
Yeah. I'll stick up for you. Call me Peter. I'll stick up for you. Yeah. Pardon?
Fair.
Yeah. No, I know. Trust me, it is a big deal the way all of these people reacted to Jesus. Nobody was neutral. Nobody was like, I could take him or leave him. You know, he seems like a nice guy, but you know what? These guys don't like him, so maybe I don't like him because they know better than, you know, than I do. You know, so nobody ends up by being, you know, by being neutral. But that's what he said somewhere. He said, I come to bring a sword. He goes, I come to divide, you know, the joints from the marrow. That's what the word of God does. But he said about dividing families. He goes, I come to, you know, pit mother against father and brother against sister. And that it's not like, you know, it's there.
But the thing was that it was pretty much death by public opinion. Because they say you have a choice between Barabbas and Jesus, and they say, hey, Barabbas is the guy we want, put him to death. So the court of public opinion
Yeah.
of that day was what put him on the cross.
You know, we'll get into that later because it's a matter of how much influence was placed on those, you know, on those people and how we get, I mean, how people get swayed, you know, today on social issues, political issues. It's whoever gets your ear first. You know, whoever gets your ear first is the one that you're gonna have to overcome if you think that there's a, you know, a challenging position to it. But the one that you hear, you know, that you hear first. I mean, I don't know how many people are the same religion and political party and Kiwanis Club member, you know, that your parents were. And you've just never been challenged to think it differently. Because they were the first ones to get your ear. And then what has to be overcome is the one who's speaking against what you heard, you know, what you heard first. So like, my point there was with the Barabbas,
Yeah.
you know, because maybe the people, they don't even know. A lot of people probably don't know who Jesus is, probably have no idea who Barabbas is. I mean, how many people are in the city jail today or the county jail today that we know? You know? Pardon? Oh, yeah. Dennis used to know them all on first name basis. But you know, we don't. So when somebody says, who would you rather have, you know, Barabbas or Jesus? Somehow they're tainted towards against Jesus. They have no idea probably who Barabbas is, but they're going to say, this guy's going to get us in trouble. This guy may just slit our throats, but these guys are going to really get us, you know, going to really get us in trouble.
You would call that peer pressure.
Yeah,
It's all peer pressure. Everybody around here.
Yeah. and you could say it on the other side too, on the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. How much of that was peer pressure of, let's go over and see what all the excitement is. Well, everybody's cheering for this guy. Maybe we should cheer for this guy, because maybe this guy has some authority and can lop our heads off if we're not, you know, if we're not cheering for him. So it could work, you know, it could work both ways. Well, we're probably far enough. Let me see. He deserves death. Oh, they were doing the prophesy, you know, to us, and they struck him. So that doesn't sound like due process to me. Just two verses here, and then we'll go. He says in verse 69 in the Peter's denial, says, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. So here, what's his name? Peter has this very opportunity to prove what I said to Jesus at the Last Supper, I would never deny you. Right there is his opportunity to say, you know what, little girl? Yes. In fact, I am his right-hand man. You know, I took my sword and I lopped off Malchus's ear. What are you going to do about it? He could have done it. Or he could have said, yes, I'm a friend of his, and I'm just here to watch the proceedings. I want peace. He could have said that too.
But it's just like those other members that Nicodemus refers to, they could have all spoke up, no, wait a minute, you're pushing this too far.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. So I don't think that people, you know, people back then are any different than we are today. And so when we would say, well, if I were there, I wouldn't have done, you know, I wouldn't have done that. But then in 70, and we'll end here, he says, but he denied it before them all. You're not just the girl, you know, probably people gathering around, especially once he was identified as a Galilean, because everybody hated the Galileans. You know, they were just on the wrong side of the tracks. And it's like, what are you doing in our neighborhood? And anyway, so he says he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. And in this account, we'll get to this later, this is the one that he actually denies him the 3 times. John's account was kind of an abbreviated, you know, version of that, but it'll be the 3 times a week and compare how he cranks up the denials higher and higher each time. So,
Might make right.
well,
And that's-
at least it seems that way. I'll be gone next Sunday. Janet's having her surgery this week, so I guess I better stay home like that. I'm bringing in the bullpen. Pastor Skip is gonna take the class next week. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Dennis is gonna do Masters Men on Friday for me. Appreciate that too. So, any last questions? Any last confessions to make about the last time you denied Christ? Yes, Ray, tell us about denying Christ.
But the whole thing with, when Jesus was arrested, he told the people who were there to arrest me and let these
Right.
people go. And they said, hey, fine, I'm getting out of here. And Peter followed him, but he was between fear and faith. Fear took precedence because he's walking behind and not beside him.
Yeah. No, it's a tough thing. Even if we don't deny Christ, I mean, if you get in a real sticky situation, I don't know what that situation is. If you're in a real sticky situation, if you don't deny Christ, I bet it runs through your mind. You know? It's like, what's my best answer here? You know, at least we do that, so. Okay, Howard, how you doing? Stay quiet. Anyway, so let me, hang on, I'm just gonna undo the thing. I can't tell what